It has been more than 16 years since the last mainline Age of Empires game released. In that time, we've seen the death of Ensemble Studios, and a general shift in how popular real-time strategy games are. Times have certainly changed, and now RTS powerhouse Relic Entertainment is taking the reins here on Age of Empires, promising to deliver an RTS for the ages on PC. So what is this new Age of Empires like? How are the graphics, and how is the performance? I will cover all of that and more in today's video dedicated to Age of Empires 4 on PC. The Age of Empires series has so much history behind it that I think Relic Entertainment certainly had a huge challenge in making this game, especially since the release of the remasters for 2 and 3 have shown how hard it is to satisfy the varying desires of such a dedicated fanbase while also making something that is somewhat new. Given what I have played of AoE 4, I think Relic have actually done an excellent job, and there are a number of reasons why Age of Empires 4 is a great new entry into the series. The first of which is simple, and it's how AoE 4 manages the new player experience. I may know a lot about playing these type of games, but not everyone should or does, and I think Age of Empires 4 teaches itself to you in a brilliant fashion. As the game starts up, you are immediately put into action as a narrator teaches you the basic mechanics of how the game works.
With a healthy supply of food, the village could start to grow. To do so, it would need more hands to share the work.
Getting you to understand the resource collecting technology and unit strengths and weaknesses. And it does not stop there. Should you want to learn more beyond this mini tutorial that you can skip, there's also a dedicated training game type where you can learn the ins and outs of how Age of Empires works. And furthermore, should you want to learn by playing, the Norman campaign in the game is kind of built around defining moments in battles that teach you aspects of the macro and micro management in Age of Empires 4 at the same time. And it all feels natural and well integrated to the experience and not annoyingly tutorialized for those who do not want a tutorial. So if you haven't played an Age of Empires game before, AoE 4 is actually a really great one to start with. The campaign is another area where Relic have really hit the nail on the head. Here there is firstly the starter Norman campaign taking you from the Battle of Hastings in 1066 over nearly 200 years of history till that consolidation of England under William Marshal and King Henry III. Playing through this campaign takes you through a lot of historical battles and actions from the perspective of the various victors. And accompanying the gameplay are very well produced 4K HDR live action documentary pieces that kind of pump you up for the mission ahead. These documentary videos describe the historical context and impact of what you are doing in the game and are spiced up with really nicely produced animations as well. I think this addition of an extra layer of history through these well-produced documentary videos in the campaign hits a cornerstone of what makes Age of Empires so endearing. The historical component is one of the main draws of this franchise, and it elevates the game and sets it apart from its contemporaries in RTS, which were typically fantastical or science fiction. These documentaries lean into that in a way that feels very appropriate. The historical retelling is not just limited to these documentaries, as in the battles themselves that you are commanding, your actions are narrated by that same voice from the documentaries, weaving you into the history of what has happened, and I think it's just brilliantly atmospheric.
The Norman army poured into York and began sacking the town as they bore down on the keep.
Beyond the Norman campaign, which took me about 8 hours to complete, there are other campaigns covering the Mongols, the Muscovite Rus, and the 100 Years' War, each replete with their own documentaries between the action and faction-specific gameplay and art. The last strength of AoE 4 is in regards to gameplay, and as silly as it sounds, it's easy to mess up gameplay in a game like this with layers of complexity that it may not need. Age of Empires 4 feels kind of like a throwback. Sure, it has new things like stances for infantry formations, or specific structures when you advance the age in the game, with gameplay bonuses and such, and there's new siege gameplay for taking and holding walls, which is actually really satisfying. But most of the core combat and unit archetypes here in the game are straight out of Age of Empires 2, with the same emphases on rock, paper, scissors that we've seen in the series before. There is added depth here with the new strategies like the aforementioned siege warfare, but by and large, this will feel familiar to fans of the series, but not be too overly complex to newcomers. There's a simplicity and bridled evolution here that makes the game easy to pick up and play without worrying so much about build order or micromanagement. Graphically, Age of Empires 4 takes a different approach than Relic Entertainment games of the past, and the precedents set by games like Age of Empires 3, which honestly was an amazing looking game for the time when it came out. Relic has made games like Dawn of War, Homeworld, and Company of Heroes, games that are at the forefront of pushing RTS technology, animation, and physical interactivity, so it was somewhat surprising to see a more simplistic approach to graphics in AoE 4. AoE 4 leans heavily on clean, low complexity graphical styles. And to be fair, identifying unit types based on their silhouette or size is incredibly easy in AoE 4, but the game does definitely not go for that busy, detailed look we've seen in these games in the past. As a part of this, Age of Empires 4 is also targeting lower end systems, I would think, so certain graphical elements do take a hit. The biggest you will notice is geometric detail and level of detail switching while in-game. At the highest setting, the general close-up geometric or texture detail I think is generally lower than you might see in other games like Total Warhammer, where even hero units here up close look rather simple. Another graphical curiosity in the game are the quality of shadow maps and ambient occlusion. These are lacking even at the highest graphical settings. When the camera sits still, it's possible to see a visible flicker and aliasing in the shadows from static buildings and even more so from moving geometry or foliage. With ambient occlusion, anytime the camera moves, AO will flicker due to its internal low-res nature. Here I feel it would have been nice had Relic allowed for shadow map resolution to scale higher on Ultra, or they could examine why shadow maps are flickering when the camera sits still. I would also have liked to have seen ambient occlusion perhaps being temporally stabilized like we see in other games, as the shadows in AO in this game, when they do flicker, are at odds with the game's otherwise very clean presentation. My last critique regarding graphics comes from how the game handles destruction. On average, I would say destruction is less fantastical and bombastic than Age of Empires 3. But one thing that bothers me about the destruction in this game is how the physics on the pieces of geometry exploding off the building run at a reduced frame rate, 30 FPS. This makes the destruction in the game look framey and almost like it is in slow motion. Essence Engine games in the past from Relic, like Company of Heroes or Dawn of War 2, definitely have the same thing happening, but I would prefer if there was an ultra setting above the high setting for physics that made such destruction run at full frame rate. But even with those critiques, I think there are some graphical aspects here that are good, like the building animation, showing these wispy versions of the structure or virtual townspeople transporting and moving about quickly. Or in general, I think the materials in the game are nice even though the textures and the models are not of the highest quality. Like this metal here, I think it looks excellent. The game also uses volumetric fog that supports shadowing, which tends to be used in those gameplay scenarios like early morning or nighttime to increase the atmosphere of the battlefield, and it looks nice when it shows up. So altogether, the game is good looking, but I wish the settings went higher to decrease those issues that you can see in the game's shadow maps and improve the frame rate of physics and destruction. The reason why I would like to see higher settings in general though is because Age of Empires 4 is very tame on the PC GPU. I know this PC I'm about to talk about is not representative at all, but an RTX 3090 in this game can essentially do 4K 120 FPS if you unlock the frame rate. Running near and around 100 FPS or 120 FPS at 4K shows that those highest settings are not exactly as high as they really could be. So higher end GPU related options would be nice to see. With that being said though, the game will still require some mid-range players to be economical with their settings to maintain performance at high resolutions. An RTX 2060, as you can see here on max settings and 1440p, in one of the heavier GPU areas in the campaign, manages to find itself in the upper 40s and mid 40s, so such a GPU would either have to play at 1080p to maintain maintain that 60 FPS frame rate or engage using optimized settings. Based upon the graphical critique I made earlier, I think optimized settings means adjusting the geometry quality option, which at high below maximum quality will save a mid-range GPU like the RTX 2060 around 9% performance at 1440p, with the geometry only looking worse really at the highest height the camera can go. After this, I find adjusting the anti-aliasing option to be a good compromise, which will further save 9% performance when set to low, with the trade-off of less stable edge quality. Altogether, these optimized settings will yield around a 14% total performance enhancement over max settings on an RTX 2060 at 1440p. Utilizing these optimized settings in a hard-to-run area, we see the RX 5700 pulling around 48 frames per second on average throughout the benchmark at optimized settings at 1440p, while the RTX 2060 is pulling ahead in an unusually high manner, performing on average 15% better than that RX 5700, and the RTX 2060 Super is performing 23% better than the RX 5700. According to pre-release review information for this game, Navi chips are performing worse than the developer would like at the moment, so I would expect future patches and driver updates to help out that issue. Beyond that issue there for Navi though, the game actually has a number of other technical issues that I need to really mention in its current launch form. The game currently has a number of technical issues, the first of which is an issue with GPU load when the camera moves. Check out this recording here of the game running at an unlocked frame rate. When the camera is sitting still at the beginning, 120 FPS, but as soon as I move the camera, take a look at the frame time graph on the left of the image. Notice the massive swings in frame time as the camera is moving around. This happens any single time the camera is moved or rotated in any fashion in Age of Empires 4 on any PC. Essentially, moving the camera for some reason nearly doubles GPU load momentarily. If you're targeting a frame rate of 60 FPS, that means GPU load would need to be around 40% utilization to not drop frames when you move the camera or scroll around the game world. This issue makes the game look very framey at times when you move the camera around, as FPS will dip significantly. Given how commonplace camera movement and scroll are in an RTS game, I really wish this did not happen, even though this performance issue will not necessarily get in the way of immediate micromanagement frame rates. I have notified the developers here of my findings and did receive a response. So it does seem like it is a technical characteristic of the game engine as it currently is, but perhaps we can expect updates on this in the future. Another issue in the game currently at launch is how seemingly single-threaded it is. And you can see this when the game is loading, as loading takes quite a long time in Age of Empires 4, even on beefy machines. And if you check out your utilization during loading, you can see how most of your PC is idle except for one thread usually. And as you can see in this loading comparison here, the game's loading speed corresponds with single-threaded processor speed, even when other things like RAM and NVMe speed are equalized. Unfortunately, this single-threadedness seems to carry over to gameplay, which will put high frame rate experiences out of the reach for many players. Check out this gameplay here as I've unlocked the frame rate on the i9-10900K. Notice how the GPU utilization here, even at 4K, is stalling below 100%. And notice how the CPU is almost completely idle, excluding one thread which is getting absolutely hammered. For a modern DirectX 12 release, I find this a bit confusing. Surely it could be possible to multi-thread this game better, as currently Age of Empires 4 is leaving a lot of your CPU very underutilized. When comparing multiple CPUs in a typical gameplay scenario of rushing into an enemy base, it's possible to see how the Ryzen 5950X and Core i9-10900K perform very similar, dropping into the low 100s when combat starts, with the 10900K running slightly faster on average over the benchmark. The Ryzen 5 3600 though falls heavily behind here when CPU limited, being around 80 FPS when there are characters animating on the screen. And mind you, this is just a 1 versus 1 scenario picked out of the campaign, which was easily reproducible. I can imagine multiplayer matches will end up being much heavier as they will be more hectic. A mid-range CPU like the 3600 here is above 60 FPS, yes, but due to the single-threadedness of this game, I think it is a shame. On that 3600, only 4 threads are really being used during this big action, and one of them is near 100% the whole time. Imagine how much better the performance could be on the CPU if the threads were sharing the load more here. The minimum requirements to get near 60 would be lower, and the high frame rate experience to 120 FPS or more would be possible on a mid-range CPU like this one, instead of being only partially possible on those massive CPUs like the 5950X and 10900K. Simply put, it appears the way this game is spreading out CPU load is not very CPU efficient in the multi-core era. Coming to the end of this review here, I think Age of Empires 4 is a great RTS and a great Age of Empires game. For all the reasons I stated in this video and more, the mood and the gameplay are just really well done. Technically, we're looking at a game though which I think has a number of issues. I would first like to see graphical settings that scale a bit higher for things like physics frame rate or shadows, and the issues concerning single-threadedness and camera movement affecting frame rate are worrying. As far as I know though, Relic knows about these issues, and I look forward to seeing how this game evolves over time with a number of patches. But that's enough from me for now, and if you did enjoy this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to get years worth of our content in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about Age of Empires 4, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen!